Welcome to FedScoop TV. I'm Wyatt Cash, and we're here at the Red Hat 2016 Government Symposium. And joining us today is Dave Egts. Dave is the Chief Technologist for the North America Public Sector at Red Hat. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks, Wyatt.
Super. Well, we're talking about all things open source, and I'd like to get your take initially on your sense for how open source has evolved in the federal government.
Yeah, well, if I look at over the past administration, open source has really flourished. And I think a lot of that is due to the culture that they've created from the top down. So if you look at things like the U.S. Digital Services and the digital playbook that they have, you go through it and open source is referenced throughout. So if you look at play number 8, they talk about considering the use of open source up and down the stack. And what that does is that provides customer choice that minimizes vendor lock-in. Secondarily, if you take a look at things like play number 13, it goes from where play 8 talks about the consumption of open source, play 13 talks about the creation of open source and open data, where they talk about defaulting to open to begin with. And the benefit there is that instead of having each agency work on things inside of a vacuum, you can get the best and brightest minds throughout agencies working together. And looking forward into the next administration, I can imagine that the trend for open source will continue to accelerate just because the value proposition is so compelling.
Well, it sounds like you know your playbook. I'm impressed.
Yeah.
Let's talk about cybersecurity next. There's often the contradiction of perceptions that because it's open source, security is a larger or more challenging concern. What would be your answer to that?
Yeah, I don't hear that as much anymore because people are realizing that you can't hide behind a binary when you're using open source. So you need to be, whenever you're writing open source code, it has to be constructed in a very secure way from the very beginning because everybody could see the code. And so that creates the incentive for whether you're a vendor or a government agency or an integrator, whenever you're writing open source code, it needs to be secure by default. You can't hide behind that binary.
Mm-hmm. And next, I'd like to talk about IT modernization as a theme. We know U.S. CIO Tony Scott has made it a very public discussion point about the aging infrastructure and nature of agency IT. How does open source play a role in helping the IT modernization effort?
Yeah, well, it's going to be critical. I see a lot of agencies whenever I talk to industry executives, they're struggling with innovation while they're spending so much of their budgets with keeping the lights on. There was a recent study that came out from IDC in October that said that 77.7% of agency budgets for IT are spent on just keeping the lights on. So $3 out of $4 are spent on operations and maintenance. And if people want to innovate, that is very hard for them. And that is actually up from 8 years ago. It was only 66%. 2/3 of budgets were spent on operations and maintenance. So it's getting worse, and especially when you think about cybersecurity and expenditure there. Every dollar that somebody spends on cybersecurity is one less dollar they could spend on innovation. So where open source can come in is that, again, we'll go back to our digital playbook. We look at play number 8, where we consider open source up and down the stack, right? Where that allows you to minimize vendor lock-in, and it shifts the power of negotiation away from the vendor back into the hands of the agencies so they could find the best software for them right away. The other thing that's going to happen with modernization is by using open source, it's going to also lower the capital expenditure to purchase software and also the operations and maintenance. If you're working as part of a community or you're working with a commercially supported vendor, you could do that for a fraction of the cost of what it costs for proprietary as well. So I think both of those things are very, very important.
That makes a lot of sense. The last question, let's talk a little bit about, more broadly, how is open source helping other areas such as collaboration, mobility, speed to market, if you will, in the federal government?
Well, I think that's going to be very, very critical. We're talking about, the default to open, right? We talk about modernization. There's been a lot of government energy and dollars that were spent on reinventing the same thing over and over and over again, independently inside of a vacuum. So if we look at the federal source code policy that came out in August, they talked about two things. One is sharing code between agencies, so they're working together. The second thing is open sourcing 20% of that code. So people outside the federal government can look at the code, use it, but also contribute back without any additional cost back to the government. And I think that whenever you think about things like speed and also with collaboration, open source plays a critical role in that, of getting the best and brightest minds throughout different agencies and even outside the government to work together to deliver value to the government, back to the stakeholder, back to the taxpayer, back to the mission, to be able to get things into production a lot faster.
Hard to argue with that.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, David Egts with Red Hat, thank you very much for stopping by and being with us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm Wyatt Cash with FedScoop. Look for more of our coverage at fedscoop.com. Thanks for being with us.